Hey, this is Torrin Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Wednesday Wisdom. This is the Black History Month edition of Wednesday Wisdom. And joining me today is Nekima Levy Armstrong. Nekima Levy Armstrong is an attorney based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. She's a social justice activist. She was also the former president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP. And she's also known for organizing one of the shutdowns of the Mall of America that went viral about 3 or 4 years ago. She was charged along with other activists, and they were facing 2 years, but they were acquitted for the protests. And most recently, she became known as one of the organizers of the protests in Minneapolis, St. Paul against the killing of George Floyd. Nekima, how are you doing this afternoon?
You know, with everything that's going on, I can say that I'm thankful to be alive, to be breathing, and to just continue to be persistent in demanding justice for our people.
All right, all right. I wanted to talk to you because what we saw last year was a rebirth of grassroots people, people who were poor and working class, taking to the streets and demanding justice against this system. I wanted to ask you about conditions for poor and working class people in Minneapolis, St. Paul, because the intensity of the protests in Minneapolis, I think it shocked a lot of the country and also the world. So could you give me some background about what conditions are like for poor and working class African Americans in Minneapolis?
Yes, so many of us refer to Minnesota and the Twin Cities as the Jim Crow North. And a big part of that has to do with the conditions that African Americans, particularly poor African Americans, have to contend with. We have some of the most egregious racial disparities in the country across income, unemployment rates, home ownership rates, as well as education. We've faced a great deal of discrimination from the banks that are very slow to lend to African Americans, even when they have a similar income and credit profile as their white counterparts. And so that has led to a huge disparity in home ownership, where roughly 25% of African Americans own their homes and over 80% of white people. And so we know that, you know, home ownership has typically been a gateway to wealth, to resources to leverage, a commodity that people can pass along to their children and grandchildren that we're missing out on in the Twin Cities. And so all of the frustration that people have had as a result of these disparities and these issues have definitely played themselves out in terms of some of the demonstrations that have happened with regard to police violence.
How did those conditions contribute to the intensity of the protests?
Well, I would say that one of the main areas of focus that we've been consistent about is challenging police violence and oppression. You know, we have, so in November of 2015, for example, we had a young man by the name of Jamar Clark, 24 years old, unarmed, was essentially shot by police within 61 seconds of them approaching Jamar. And Jamar wasn't doing anything wrong at the time. This happened right in the heart of the Black community. There were dozens of witnesses, all Black, to Jamar being killed. And the outrage and the frustration and the grief from Jamar being killed led to an 18-day occupation outside of the 4th Precinct police station. And that was the first time in the country, from my understanding, that anything like that had happened. And a lot of the people who were out there were low-income Black people from that community, along with allies as well as activists. And so we've been building, you know, for many, many years in terms of having outlets to express our frustration, taking to the streets, shutting things down, showing up at the halls of power to demand that our voices be heard and that the powers that be and mainstream white Minnesotans take seriously what we're enduring in our community. I think that the issue of police violence and what low-income Black people experience go hand in hand, because a lot of these police abuses happen in the poor Black section of the Twin Cities. That's by design. A lot of the cops who come into our neighborhoods don't live in our city. Over 92%, as a matter of fact, live outside of the city of Minneapolis. And a lot of times they're over patrolling and over policing poor Black communities. They're able to abuse us and typically get away with it. And this has been going on for decades.
You mentioned earlier that you call Minneapolis and Minnesota the Jim Crow North. There seems to be an idea that all the injustice against African Americans in America happens in the South, but we've seen a lot of things happening on the West Coast, in the Northwest, and in the Midwest. Do you think that there is that the media and the historians turn a blind eye to what's going on in the North because it's not quite as visible?
Absolutely. We've, of course, all learned a great deal about Southern racism and the institution of slavery being perpetuated in Southern states. But we hear hardly anything about Northern racism and the fact that when many of our ancestors escaped from slavery, they went north in search of a new life and jobs. But what they encountered was at times extreme violence and racism at the hands of white people who did not want to live in harmony with Black folks, who saw us as being inferior. And we saw, I would say, laws and policies that were put in place to exclude us, similarly to what happened in the South. And many Northern places also perpetuated the institution of slavery. I mean, most people are shocked when they hear that there was slavery in New York, slavery in Ohio. And then, when you think about Minnesota, we're the home essentially of the Dred Scott case from 1857, where Dred Scott was enslaved, and his master at the time moved him to Minnesota, where he was able to live as a free man, got married and everything. And then when it was time for his master to leave, the master tried to bring Dred Scott back into slavery. And so he sued for his freedom. And when you look at the Supreme Court case that happened as a result of that, it really, from my perspective, articulates a lot of the sentiments that are centered around anti-Blackness and oppression. You had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, Roger B. Taney, say that the Black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. And that because of us being Black, we're not able to even sue. We weren't considered as equals. And so I think about that in the context of Northern racism and how comfortable it was for slave owners to travel to Minnesota, and to vacation, in a place like Minnesota, to own property. We had Lake Calhoun, which was named after John Calhoun. And I believe he had become president or vice president. But the point about John Calhoun is that he was very much in support of the institution of slavery. And so why would, in a liberal place like Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, we would have Lake Calhoun and Calhoun Square? And so, people have been protesting that for years. And finally, the lake has been returned back to its original name, which is a Native American name. So we have had to fight these battles, in the Twin Cities. We've had to deal with redlining over the years, which again contributes to the housing issues that Black people face in the Twin Cities.
Do you think that history and that legacy of legislation has influenced how policing is done in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities?
Absolutely. I mean, for decades, people have turned a blind eye to the issues of police abuse because they were primarily happening to low-income Black people. And I think that what's important about that is just the fact that so often as poor Black people, our voices are rarely being heard. We rarely are at the decision-making tables and are given the opportunities to weigh in on policies and laws that are being put in place that are going to have an impact on us. And so with regard to the Twin Cities and police abuse, we've had so many, primarily white folks in power, but also some people of color as well, who have completely turned a blind eye to the issue of police violence. And as a matter of fact, rather than changing the policies and the practices and firing cops, our city council over the years has quietly settled tens of millions of dollars in excessive force lawsuits. And all of that had created a culture in which George Floyd could be killed on May 25th, 2020.
Moving into the horrible death of George Floyd, that death and the video of his death pulled the wool off whatever was happening in Minneapolis and the world, got to take a look at it. With that attention, a lot of media focus came on to Minneapolis. There was also a lot of organizing that happened that was going on, as well as local organizers that were there in place already. What effect did that attention and all that notoriety and publicity have on local organizing in Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Well, I would say that, it's been pretty interesting because we had a lot of outside money that came into the Twin Cities and that went to organizations that were being cherry picked by white liberals and white progressives to receive literally millions of dollars. So there's been a lot of dispute and debate around those situations. The grassroots organizers, have continued to essentially work with very, very limited resources in organizing protests and as well as getting resources to people in need in our community. So we were flush with resources, but it wasn't in the way that people would expect in terms of who has access to those resources and some of the decision making that they're able to do. But I think beyond that, we were able to see that there's a lot of solidarity around the country and around the world from people who are now paying attention to what we are experiencing in the Twin Cities. We tried to tell people years ago, that this is not a bastion of liberalism and progressivism as people might think.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, the best place to live for African Americans and other people of color. And people had a really hard time believing us because of Minnesota's unearned reputation as being progressive. Minnesota certainly is wealthy, and I would say it's progressive for white folks, but certainly not for African Americans and other people of color. We are in many ways still treated as if we are inferior. And it takes a lot. Why should we have to go and shut down the Mall of America, which is at the time was, probably the largest or close to the largest mall in the country? Why should we have to shut down freeways and put our lives on the line in order for our voices to be heard? But we've had to go to those extreme lengths because of the forces that we are fighting against that want to maintain the status quo and forces that are comfortable with the abuses that African Americans routinely experience in the Twin Cities.
When the notoriety happened with the George Floyd uprisings and protests, was there a conscious effort to kind of center activists from the area and give them platforms to speak and talk about their own lived experience, or do you think that was overshadowed?
Well, I think that for many of us who've been organizing consistently over the years, we did what we normally do, which is to hold demonstrations, call out elected officials who are not doing their jobs, educate people about the issues, and encourage them to show up. So we did, exactly what we have been doing since at least 2014, when Mike Brown was killed. That's when, our community was really activated. Although we did hold some marches and demonstrations after Trayvon Martin was killed as well. And so consistently over the years, we've been out there, whether there's a high profile police killing or someone who no one knows, who's been killed by police. Activists and community members continue out on the front lines time and time again. And so we didn't change our process because of the most recent police killing. We just continue to be who we are. And those are folks who are committed to the cause of justice. And whether the world is paying attention or not, we're going to continue to take a stand and fight and advocate for what is right. I don't know about, whether local activists were being overshadowed. I think that the moment itself was bigger than most people could have imagined, especially because, the Black Lives Matter movement and other emerging movements and organizations have been talking about these issues for so long. I think for some people, unfortunately, it took witnessing an officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8.5 minutes for people to understand what we mean by the culture of policing being extremely violent, and the fact that there's a significant need for change. Now, of course, you have some people who will look at a situation like Derek Chauvin, who is the main officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck and killed him, along with those other 3 officers who were involved. People will just see them as a few bad apples or 4 bad apples. And what we're saying is, no, this is an entire system that has been built on oppression and the backs of Black people, and that has been sent a message that they can have unfettered power, significant access to resources, and they can actually kill people and not be held accountable, which of course is very disturbing, and is a bastion of the institution of slavery.
Mm. All right. Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Justine Demond, George Floyd. There have been several high-profile killings of police killings in the Twin Cities area. Is that indicative of the cultural violence in that police department, in those police departments, and what's been done to affect that, if anything?
Mm-hmm. And so you named off several other people, but there have been others as well who were killed since Jamar Clark. And so to add to those names, Chaser Fung Vu, a Hmong man, was shot multiple times by police. Mario Benjamin, who was in a domestic situation, shot and killed by police. Travis Jordan as well, who had a mental health crisis. Thurman Blevins, who was basically hunted down in an alley in 2018 and killed. So we've had many, many people who've been killed by the Minneapolis Police Department. Of all the people that you and I both named, the only person who wasn't was Philando Castile, who was killed in Falcon Heights by the St. Anthony Police Department that was basically contracting with them. And of course, we consider these, Minnesota killings, Twin Cities killings, and so all of us, show up. But we know that our culture of policing in Minnesota is a violent culture. We know that there is a tendency to, again, when these types of incidences happen, to demonize victims, and to find a way to justify the conduct of an officer, even when there's no real justification, even when we're seeing someone be killed on video, and being told we need to wait for more information, which is absolutely absurd. So I do think that we have a cultural problem with regard to policing. I also think that this is indicative of the fact that, Minnesota is 85% white, very heavily Norwegian culture in terms of the population, Scandinavian culture. So all of those things play a role in terms of people's willingness to talk about race, willingness to own the ugly aspects of what is happening with regard to race and police violence and those disparities that we talked about earlier. And it makes it difficult for our voices as Black people to be heard. And that's why we've had to go to such extreme lengths in terms of shutting things down and being arrested and being consistent, whether it's warm outside or freezing cold temperatures. Literally, we have, below zero weather too often during the winter, and we are still out there, which is remarkable, from my perspective, but that's how driven people are in terms of wanting to see change take place.
All right. What were some of the demands that local activists presented to the power structure in those cities during the protests? And have any of those demands been met? Have you seen any changes on the legislative?
So we have put together um, a number of recommendations. So, my day job, I'm the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on supporting Black and Brown women of color activists in key cities around the country. I'm also the founder of the Racial Justice Network, which is a grassroots organization that has been in existence since 2018, and we help organize a lot of the protests and arrange meetings with elected officials as well. We work with other organizations such as our two BLM chapters, Black Lives Matter Minnesota, Black Lives Matter Twin Cities, um, Communities United Against Police Brutality, CARE Minnesota, which is the Council on American and Islamic Relations, and Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar. And so most of our organizations work collaboratively on these issues. And again, it's not just something that happens when there is a high profile incident, but we're literally doing policy work, doing research, having, backroom meetings with elected officials, trying to get them to adopt our recommendations. And most of the time they won't listen. So like, for example, a year and a half before, no, maybe about a year before George Floyd was killed, we started looking into the police union contract and making recommendations to the terms of the contract that we felt were contributing to some of the violence. So just to give an example, police in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis are typically able to work overtime. And there's no real monitoring in terms of, someone working, let's say a 10-hour shift on, as a police officer, and then working 10 hours of overtime, and how that could affect, a person's judgment, how they treat people, et cetera. Well, when you look at the case of Justine Damon Rusacek, white woman killed by a Black Muslim Somali officer in July of 2017, the former officer, Muhammad Noor, had worked overtime, and hadn't really had any sleep from our understanding before he, made the fatal decision to shoot Justine Damon Rusacek. And so we made these, recommendations grounded in research and best practices. They fell on deaf ears. And as a matter of fact, the city and the union pushed to go straight into mediation so that they could shut the public out of those processes. And right now, that's still an ongoing issue that we've been locked out of the ability to intervene, make recommendations, et cetera, with regard to the union contracts. We also feel that, they need a new policy surrounding cops who've engaged in excessive force. Right now, they're barely being disciplined. Many of them are still on the force. They shouldn't be. And a lot of that has to do with the arbitration rules, that when the chief, or the mayor fire cops, they're able to get their jobs back pretty easily, and that's a legal mechanism that, has played a role in what's gone on. We are also pushing for legislative changes. So a coalition of us, including families supporting families, which are families of victims of police killings, where they're pushing for things like eliminating the statute of limitations, or reducing it at a minimum so that families have up to 10 years to file suit after their loved one has been killed by police. So those things are ongoing. We also saw some legislation that happened during the special session last year. There were watered down bills, but at the same time, it was movement that we had never seen before from our legislature. So for example, now there's a mandate for autism training for police officers because of, the fatal ways in which they typically respond during mental health calls, or if somebody has a disability. So we've seen some changes. We just haven't seen enough, quick enough. We have seen Minneapolis police roll out a new disciplinary policy and roll out a new initiatives surrounding the use of body cameras and, the requirements to always keep a camera on, things like that have happened. And of course, one of the things that happened that was unprecedented was that our chief, the first Black chief in the history of the city of Minneapolis, fired all 4 cops within hours of them killing George Floyd. That had never happened before in the state of Minnesota. And that wouldn't have happened without the pressure that we have applied as activists and community members in demanding these changes. But again, not enough has happened soon enough. And the last thing I'll say on that is that our city council members, they basically, in my opinion, were trying to seize the spotlight by saying that they were going to dismantle MPD and reimagine public safety and put some new system in place. Now, they did this within days of George Floyd being killed. They made these announcements without any plan, without having done research, and without having talked to the Black community. And we're the community most likely to experience community violence and police violence. So why would you bypass the community that has suffered, significantly, and go to white folks in Powderhorn Park to announce that you're going to dismantle the police? So of course, as activists, many of us pushed back. We said, you don't have a plan. You're going to put us in worse danger. And Minneapolis is going to become like the Wild Wild West because people are going to think no one's in charge. And that's exactly what has happened. We have had a significant uptick in shootings, civilians being killed, carjackings, and all kinds of things that have gone on since the city council members went to Powderhorn Park and made a declaration that they didn't even have the legal backing to do at the time.
Do you think that might have been deliberate? Do you think they might have dismantled so they could see an uptick in crime so they can say, well, we need to bring police back in again?
No, I think that they just don't know what the hell they're doing, because these are the same people who we went to and not only got on the record at their city council meetings, we've disrupted city council meetings. We have spoken directly with city council members and put recommendations on the table, and they completely ignored us until suddenly the world is watching after George Floyd is killed, and they're feeling a need to show how progressive they are and that they're doing something.